Okay, we've reached a new chapter in macroeconomics. Today we'll be talking about the ADAS model. The ADAS stands for the Aggregate Demand and Aggregate Supply model. And I think you would guess by now that the ADAS model is actually made up of the aggregate demand curve as well as the aggregate supply curve. So what is aggregate demand? Well, a simple definition for aggregate demand would be the total demand for final goods and services given a certain price level in an economy. So this total demand actually comes from the households, the firms, and the government in a particular country, and even the foreigners. And when I say the price level here, I'm actually referring to the nominal price. Nominal price here means that the price is given in terms of dollars. So as you can see, the aggregate demand curve is actually very closely related to your ISLM model. Aggregate supply, on the other hand, is the total supply of final goods and services given a certain price level in an economy. And obviously, it is the firms that are providing this supply. We're also going to learn about the sticky wage model, which is not very important, but we're going to learn how it's actually used to derive the aggregate supply curve and why the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. So basically, the ADAS model is a macroeconomic model that explains the relationship between the general price level, which we denote as P, with the output GDP or income, which we denote as Y. So the general price level, or P, actually measures the overall prices of goods and services in an economy. So countries are going to have what we call price index. Okay, so they use a price index to understand what's the price level in an economy. And more commonly, people use the Consumer Price Index, or CPI for short. And what you have to remember is that the price level is an endogenous variable, which means it is a variable that is within the model itself. Okay, and most importantly, the price level does not change by itself. It always changes because of some external factor. So a really good question to ask is, when do we use the ADAS model? Well, number one, we use the ADAS model when an economy has got flexible prices and wages. One important point I need you to remember is that wages are not as flexible as prices. I will explain this later in the video. Well, it is quite obvious that you should use the ADAS model when there is an economy with flexible prices and wages, because this is what the ADAS model looks like. You've got the price level on the vertical axis. Okay, so when prices and wages are flexible, you know that you're going to have to analyze how prices is going to change given certain scenarios, right? So that is why you're going to need to use the ADAS model when you've got flexible prices and wages. Number two, you're going to need the ADAS model when you're talking about the long run. Why? Because in the long run, that's where prices and wages are flexible. And lastly, of course, as discussed in chapter 12, we use the ADS model when we're trying to analyze the economy based on the classical view. So just let me remind you why you don't really need the ADS model for the Keynesian view. Alright, so let me show you what the ADS model looks like for Keynesian view. So you got a downward sloping AD curve, but you have a horizontal and flat AS curve. So no matter how much you change your aggregate demand, your price level is still going to be fixed at P0. Okay, so P0 is the same as P1 or for all other price levels that you can mention. So the price level here sticks at P0. So there's really no point. Since the prices don't change, there's no point analyzing the price level. Okay, so now we're going to figure out how to derive the aggregate demand curve. Now to derive the AD curve, you're going to need the ISLM model. So we know that the ADS model is a graph with price on the vertical axis and income on the horizontal axis, right? Therefore, we need to change the price level to see a change in the income level, then we can get our aggregate demand curve. And deriving the AD curve is the only time where the price level changes on its own. Okay, so let's move on to the derivation of the AD curve. You're going to need two sets of graph, okay? So the graph on top is going to be your ISLM model, and the graph below is going to be your ADS model. Take note that the ADS model has got price on the vertical axis instead of interest rates. Just in case some of you are wondering why I use the nominal interest rates, which is represented with I, for the vertical axis in the ISLM model instead of R, which is the real interest rates, let me explain why. We know that the nominal interest is equal to the real interest plus the inflation rate. Now, here's the thing. The inflation rate in an economy with flexible prices and wages can still be equal to zero. Well, that's because a change in price is not the same as inflation. Inflation is the rate of change at which the price level is changing. And the change in price here could either be a one-time change or a two-time change. So it is not exactly a rate of change. So I here still equals to R. So it doesn't matter whether you use I or R. So what you want to do first is to establish your initial equilibrium for the ISLM model. So the initial equilibrium for the ISLM model is going to give an initial equilibrium output level of Y0 for both the ISLM model and the ADAS model. Notice that in the LM curve, I have a price level of P0. So let's assume that P0 is somewhere around there. So with a price level of P0 and an income level of Y0, I have an initial equilibrium point or point A in my ADAS model. Now the first step will be to assume that the price level is going to fall. So when the price level falls, what happens is that your real money supply is going to increase due to a smaller denominator. Hence, your LM curve is going to shift down, right? So the price level falls from P0 to P1, and the LM curve shifts down to LM1, M0, P1. So after all the dynamics in the ISLM model that you have learned in the previous videos, you will notice that we reach point B in the ISLM equilibrium, and we have a new income level of Y1. So since the price level that gives an output of Y1 is P1, this is going to be point B, the new equilibrium point in the ADS model. What you're going to do next is to assume linearity, combine points A and B, and that is going to give you your aggregate demand curve. So as you can see, it's really easy. I want you to try it by yourself. Try to derive the aggregate demand curve with the price level increasing instead of decreasing. Okay, awesome. Now let's look at what affects the aggregate demand curve. Since the AD is derived from these two curves, we know that it is affected by the IS and the LM. So what affects your IS curve? Well, it's your government spending, the lump sum or the proportional tax rate that affects the IS curve, as well as consumption, investment, exports, as well as imports. Okay, so we'll see this in open economy. What affects the LM curve is the nominal money supply. And also not to forget, the price level in the economy also affects the LM curve. The LM curve is affected by the price level because the price level affects the real money supply in an economy. And since the price level is an endogenous variable in the ADAS model, changes in the price level are going to cause movements along the ADAS curve, as you will see over here, moving from point A to point B if the price level falls from P0 to P1. And since these three items here represent some form of fiscal policy, and the nominal money supply can be manipulated to cater for monetary policy, what we do is we put these items into the bracket that shows what affects the AD curve. Well, these are the three items that would change more often, so that is why we will put those things into the bracket. Now, talking about the dynamics of the AD curve, we will only be going through the dynamics when we talk about the ADAS model combined. Okay, now that we know how to derive the AD curve, now we're going to talk about deriving the AS curve. So first, what you need to know is that the aggregate supply curve is an upward sloping curve, okay? And there are four theories to explain why the AS curve is upward sloping, okay? But for today, you're only going to be learning one of those theories, which is called the sticky wage model. And to explain the sticky wage model, I need to go through with you the wage bargaining process in a hypothetical economy. So basically, we're trying to answer the question of how are nominal wages being determined? So here's how it goes. In our hypothetical economy, there's going to be a labor union that represents a competitive supply of labor. So when the labor market is competitive, what we're saying is that everyone out there is being paid the same nominal wage. So a labor union, which represents all the workers in an economy, is going to go into a bargaining process with the firms. So let's take a look at the objectives of these two entities over here. The labor union wants to help the workers maintain their real wage, whereas the firms will want to minimize the real wage. Why? Because if the firms minimize the real wage, then the cost of production is cheaper. So take note that the firms here are the ones that demands the labor. So obviously the labor union and the firms have got very differing goals. And also obviously, the entity that has got the larger bargaining power is the one that's going to have more influence over the nominal wage in this economy. So let me explain to you how bargaining power can shift between the labor unions and the firms. And an easy way to look at this would be to look from the firm's perspective. Okay, so I want you to imagine that you are the owner of the only firm in this country. Okay, so since you're the business owner, I'm going to dress you up really nice. Okay, I'm going to give you a nice hat, a nice mustache, I'm going to give you a cane, and of course I'm going to give you a bow tie. Okay, so you're like a boss. Now let's assume that to run your business, you're only going to need one guy. We are now going to take a look at two different scenarios. Now, the first scenario is when the economy has got high unemployment. Okay, so there's high unemployment, so there are about 6 guys that do not have a job. Okay, so you're the only guy in this country that can offer these 6 guys a job. So you can just simply hire whoever that's willing to work at the lowest wage. So basically, the labor has got no say in how much they want to be paid. Okay, they just gotta accept whatever that you're gonna pay them. So the guy that accepts the lowest pay is gonna get a job. So as you can see, when there's high unemployment, the labor union has got low bargaining power, and the business, the firms, have got the high bargaining power in this case. Okay, so that's the case where we have high unemployment. Now let's look at the case where we have low unemployment. Okay, so to bring things to the extremes, there's only going to be one guy that doesn't have a job. So since you need to hire one guy, this is the only guy in the entire economy that is available for you to hire. And since he knows that he's the only guy and he knows that you need him, he's going to start to negotiate his pay with you. So as you can see, when the economy has got low unemployment, the labor union actually has got a higher bargaining power, and the businesses will have a lower bargaining power. Okay, so that is how the bargaining power shifts between the labor union and the firms. Alright, the next thing I'm going to explain to you is why the nominal wages are sticky or rigid. Well, the reason is because your employment contracts are usually fixed for a certain period of time. And within those contracts, it is also stated the amount of nominal wages that this particular worker is going to be getting, right? So the nominal wages are also set in the contracts. Since contracts are legally binding for a certain period of time, you cannot freely change the amount of nominal wage just like that. So if there's a change in the price level today, which affects your real wage, you will only be able to change the nominal wage only much later. So that is why wages are sticky or rigid. Alright, so now we're going to go on and derive the AS curve. I need you to assume two things, okay? I'm going to need you to assume that in the labor market, there is always an excess supply of labor, so that firms can freely determine the amount of labor they want to hire. When this happens, we say that the firms have the right to manage. The second thing I need you to assume is that in the production function of this economy, there is going to be decreasing returns. Okay, so you're going to need two other graphs to derive your AS curve. So this is the first graph with real wage on the vertical axis and the amount of labor on the horizontal axis. Now the graph below is going to have labor on the horizontal axis and income on the vertical axis. So the top graph is the labor market and the bottom graph is the production function. So what you want to do is you want to add in your ADAS model as well so that you can use that to derive your AS curve. So let's take a look at the labor market. So this is your downward sloping labor demand curve, which is also your marginal product of labor. And you have a supply of labor which is placed very far to the right. And in the production function, you're going to have a curve that looks like this. So this shows the decreasing returns that we were talking about. So let's assume that the price level now is at P0, which gives me a real wage of W0 over P0. This gives me an equilibrium in point A in the labor market, which means that the firms will be hiring L0 amount of labor. And in the production function, the equilibrium at point A is going to give me an output of Y0. So in the ADS model, you got Y0, and what you're going to do is the initial point, the initial equilibrium point of the AS curve is going to be here, point A, right? You get Y0 when the price level is P0. So what you want to assume now is that the price level is going to fall, okay? So the price level is going to fall from P0 to P1. And what's going to happen to your real wages is that it's going to increase due to a smaller denominator. So the real wages go up. In the labor market, we are now at point B, which means that the firms will be hiring lesser people. And in the production function, you're going to be at point B, which gives me a smaller level of output. So I've got Y1. Now in the ADS model, I'm going to have a new point, point B. Now I think you should know where we'll be going from here. What we're going to do is we're going to assume linearity, and we're going to connect points A and B to give you your aggregate supply curve, which is affected by the wage rate. And to be more specific, this is your short run aggregate supply curve. So here's my conclusion of the sticky wage model. The short-run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping because of nominal rigidities where the wage does not change while the price level changes. So that's the sticky wage model explaining why the AS curve is upward sloping. Alright, now let's go on into the long run. Okay, let's say Y0 is actually equals to your natural rate of output. This means that there's going to be a recession because Y1 is lesser than the natural rate of output. So when there's a recession, there is also going to be high unemployment. And as discussed earlier, when there's high unemployment, the firm's bargaining power over the wages is going to increase against the labor union. So we know that the firm's goal is to reduce the nominal wage so that they can minimize their costs. Therefore, the nominal wage is going to decrease until the real wages reach the original level. So let's go back to the three graphs and see what's going to happen. Look at the labor market. Your real wage is going to fall back to its original level, so you got W1 over P1 is still the same price level. We now reach point C, which is also point A in the labor market, right? And L0 is also the new L2. So in the production function, we're also going to go back to point A, where the output is now going back to Y0, which we can also call Y2. So going back to the ADAS model, what you notice is that the price level is still the same. Therefore, the new equilibrium point will be over here, point C. Now what you're going to do is, again, you're going to connect points A and C, and what you have here is actually your long-run aggregate supply curve. So this vertical long-run aggregate supply curve actually shows that in the long run, prices and wages are fully flexible. Okay, your output level will always be at the natural rate of output. So just going to add in a aggregate demand curve here. Okay, so you're at point C. If I'm going to shift this aggregate demand curve outwards, to increase the demand in the economy, you'll notice that the income level does not change. Now, if you recall what we were saying about the classical view, the classical view says that the government need not intervene when there's a recession or an economic boom. In the long run, the economy will always go back to its natural rate of output. Okay, so just let me combine all the curves together and show you what the ADAS model looks like in the end. So that's your AD curve, your SAS curve, and your LRAS curve. And the initial equilibrium is going to be at point A over here. So this is an overview of how the ADAS curve looks like. We're going to go on to the dynamics in the next video. Now, since you know why the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, the question would be, why is the AD curve downward sloping? So the answer is quite simple. The reason why the AD curve is downward sloping is because the ISLM model says so. Well, that is wrong, okay? So you don't say this. There is actually a theory to explain why the AD curve is downward sloping. So let me share with you the intuition on how you get this downward sloping AD curve. Okay, let's take a look at the price level. What happens when the price level falls? Well, basically, when the price level falls, the real money supply is going to increase. And the real money supply increases, what you'll notice is that interest rates are going to fall. If you don't believe me, let's take a look at the money market. Okay? So this is my money market diagram with the demand curve and the supply curve there. So I got an initial interest rates of I0, given that the real money supply is M over P0. So if the real money supply increases, so the supply curve is going to shift to the right, and there we have a lower level of interest rates. So what happens when interest rates fall? Well, we know that investments are going to increase, and once your investments are going to increase, your aggregate expenditure is also going to increase, which will of course give you a higher level of output. So take a look at the directional change for the price level and the income level. What you notice is that the price and income actually has a negative relationship, which means that the AD curve is downward sloping. Okay, so let's look at another scenario where the price level increases instead. Okay, so this is going to cause the real money supply to fall, okay, which will give me a higher interest rate as seen in the money market diagram. Okay, so when interest rates rise, investments will fall, giving me a lower aggregate expenditure and a lower income level. So you see, the same negative relationship still applies between the price level and the income level. And you know when there is a negative relationship, you're going to get a downward sloping curve. So this effect over here is known as the Keynes interest rate effect. Okay, and it is because of the Keynes interest rates effect, and that is why we have the downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Alright, that brings me to the end of this part 1 video on the ADAS model. Thank you so much for studying with Quickenomics. I'll see you in the next video and we're going to talk more about the ADAS model. Take care.